Welcome to 2023 with Agnes Kunkel. In 2020, the world was hit by COVID-19. It was like a time machine. Find out what the world might look like in spring 2023 and how we will need to adapt. 2023, your window to a world beyond COVID-19. The Miller family is invited to celebrate Daniel's birthday, the doctor of the family and a good friend of Xenia and Thomas, at his favorite restaurant. After the family checked the air conditioning rating and the menu online, the Millers are having a great time on the spot. While Xenia is waiting for her cocktail at the bar, she realizes that her old school friend Monica is one of the waitresses at the restaurant. Both haven't met for years and were really happy to see each other again after such a long time. Monica, I knew you went to work with gastronomy after we left school, but I really did not expect to meet you here today. How are you? Xenia asks. Monica starts telling her about the love of her job and how happy she is that she got the position here. Things were very different for her during and after the corona pandemic in 2020. She had lost her job back then. When schools and the kindergartens closed to stop the virus from spreading, she had to take care of her kids at home. The restaurant she was working for in 2020 still delivered food to customers, but she could not help deliver or prepare the food. As a single mom, she had no choice but to stay at home with the kids. So, she was one of the first staff members who got fired as the corona pandemic started. Xenia tells her friend how glad she was that Thomas mainly homeschooled the kids during the lockdown, as he had a lot of fun with Christy and Melanie. But let me tell you one thing, Xenia sighs. I am not sure if the kids learned much. Melanie was asked by her teacher to write a paper on the topic, Do pirates still exist, and how do you know? Can you imagine what Thomas told our daughter to write? She asked, still in disbelief. No, because I have never seen one.
Hello, I'm Agnes Kunkel, your host in 2023, your window to the world beyond COVID-19. We have now over 26 million confirmed cases worldwide and over 860,000 people have confirmed to have died. Today it's 3rd of September 2020. Today we will talk about a brilliant piece of research that generated great media echo all over the world. Our guest today is Titan Alon. Titan Alon is Assistant Professor of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. He was a Louis A. Simpson postdoc in macroeconomics at Princeton University. He worked as a research associate in the macroeconomics group at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. He received the Bachelor of Economics from Harvard University. He earned a Master in Economics from London School of Economics and a PhD in Economics from Northwestern University. His actual research focuses on macroeconomics, labor, and growth. He earned the Robert Eisner Fellowship for distinguished work in both teaching and research, the Northwestern Doctoral Fellowship, and the Northwestern University Teaching Award. Welcome, Professor Alon. Welcome, Titan.
Thank you, Agnes. Thank you for having me, and thank you for that very flattering introduction.
No, you are really a star, I guess. I won't
argue.
We saw your paper, The Impact of COVID-19 on Gender Equality, and we were really electrified, and I guess we were not the only one.
I'm glad to hear that.
It was many articles made references all over the world. Why do you think was the media echo outside of the scientific world so big?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's kind of rare for academic economic research to make the jump into the public dialogue quite often. But I think the reason this paper did so effortlessly is because it really resonated, I think, with many people. It's very rare as an academic economist to write a paper and to receive, say, emails from people around the country saying, oh, I read your paper. It really touched my heart. It really describes how I'm living these days. It's never happened to us before, but for this paper, we've received many emails from people in the United States, outside the country, saying, I saw your paper in the newspaper. I saw it on the news. And I just have to say, you're really speaking about my life, and I really feel very much day to day what you're writing about. And I think that's the reason it's caught fire. It's just that it's true, and it's really describing what many people are going through.
Yeah, and it's very practical. We will come to this later, but it's very, very practical. How did you decide to do research on this topic?
That's so there's sort of two dimensions to that. It's why did we study gender equality during the COVID crisis versus more generally? I think more generally, the answer is that as a macroeconomist, I'm really interested in trying to understand why some countries are rich and other countries are poor. And if you look around the world, one thing that's very stark, one really big difference between wealthy economies and developing economies is the extent to which they use their female workforce or are able to exploit the talent of their female population. And so that's kind of the broad motivation I've had to thinking about these issues. Why we chose to focus on this in the era of COVID is that, we have decades of research in economics looking at kind of the dynamics between men and women and why women and men perform differently in the labor market. And a lot of this research has concluded things like, it's very related to childcare, the way childcare is split, the way husbands and wives bargain. And it was all very theoretical, of course, until the most recent crisis, where suddenly all the kind of issues that we've been talking about, that we've been thinking about, that economists have been theorizing, suddenly was right there in the news, right there in the data. And so it became kind of the moment in history where all of this thinking kind of met the pavement. And there was really a question of, can we now take all this theory, all this thinking, and translate it into policy that can actually help people, particularly in these challenging times? And that's really been the big driver.
Like a global field study or a laboratory for your theories.
That's exactly right. It's the large the COVID crisis has been the Large Hadron Collider of gender economics, if I may say so.
And I guess families came closer together in the crisis when everyone was at home. So like Xenia and Thomas, these two parents in our little story, how did families or do families handle the situation?
So I can say two things. We can talk about how the families are handling the current situation and how it maybe differs from what has happened in the past. I think the current crisis is sort of unprecedented in sort of two dimensions. One is that, relative to past recessions, it's really women that are being hammered very hard in this recession. And the second unique characteristic of this recession is the unusual childcare demands that have accompanied the economic downturn. And so that's really what we try to focus on, is to what extent there are economic implications of, say, things like school closures, the absence of childcare and stuff like that. And looking at the data, one thing we've really seen is that the response from households has not been a kind of individualistic response, but rather a sort of a joint family unit responding to the crisis. So this is typical in recessions. In most recessions, it's typically men who lose the job. And we have something in economics called the added worker effect, where in a normal recession, the husband will lose the job, the wife will join the labor force and sort of stabilize the financial situation of the family. One thing that's changed in this current crisis is that has not been an option, mainly because of the childcare demands. And so what we've seen instead is that, husbands have been stepping up more, in part, to kind of deal with these childcare demands, but really, it's more of the same, in the sense that women have been burdened by much of the childcare. And as a result, they're suffering from the labor market consequences, the loss of employment that sort of accompanies that. And that's sort of the defining characteristic.
In the last chapter of your research paper, you have some figures about childcare provided by single parents and married parents, how it was, how many hours they invested in the childcare before the pandemic, how much they had to invest during pandemic with closed schools and such stuff and stay-at-home orders, and maybe how it will be afterwards. What I was really jaw-dropping is that married fathers in a normal week invested maybe 2.7, when I see it correctly, 2.7 hours per week. and that this jumped to, I guess, nearly the fourfold or so, 12 hours. That's
a huge
game changer.
increase.
That's a game changer.
Yes, that is a game changer. I think that that's kind of one of the most lasting consequences of this current recession that we've seen. It's really a inversion in the norms about who is supposed to take care of the children. And I think historically, when the data that you referred to kind of shows that historically it is wives or women, mothers, who take on something like 70% of childcare demands in normal times. And I think one thing that's quite unusual that we're seeing in this crisis is for the first time, out of necessity mostly, many husbands are kind of stepping up and doing more childcare than they've ever done before. And so, yes, I think what you point out is certainly shocking. It's also certainly, what's driving the unique characteristics of this recession.
Why did this shift that the men were now, so the married fathers, we are speaking at this moment about married fathers, why did this shift so dramatically? What was the structure behind this?
It really is a shift of necessity, if I could describe it in a single word. I want you to imagine a prototypical couple in the United States, or the kind that we're talking about, I should say at least, where the wife may be working in some essential job, say healthcare as a doctor or as a nurse, and the husband is working as an office worker. This is kind of a representative couple in the United States. And so when the recession hit, it is much, much more likely that the husband would have been able to telecommute than his wife. And so just out of the necessities of childcare, you now have a child at home for 8 to 10 hours a day. You have a husband who's telecommuting. You have a wife who can't work in a hospital remotely. And so out of necessity, someone has to watch the kids. And as a result, it's been the husbands. And so we really think that this necessity, this lack of other options, this inability to appeal to traditional social norms in the way childcare has been split is really driving the change. And the really big question for us is to what extent this will last, or I should say outlast the current situation.
And therefore you built, I think, a very sophisticated economic model. When I understood correctly, one of the novelties of your model is that you use a dual gender model. What does this mean?
Yes, so one thing we try to take very seriously in our models is this idea that particularly when households make decisions, it's not a unitary person. It's not an individual making a decision, but it's oftentimes, the typical example being a husband and wife and kids, and the husband and wife typically negotiate or bargain over outcomes and how to deal with negative shocks to the family's finances and things like that. And so the extent to which a husband or a wife is able to influence the decisions of the family depend on many sort of factors, kind of what the labor market earnings of these two couples are, what the cultural backgrounds that they come from. And so when we think about the macroeconomy and the way different economic shocks, as we say in economics, the way different shocks will hit a family and cause the family to change the way they're working, to change the way they're taking care of their children, to kind of understand these channels, we really need an economic model of it. And that had been lacking, I think, for a very long time in economics. And so that has really been what we've been pushing on. That's what my co-authors and I have been developing. And I think this current crisis shows kind of firsthand why such a model is necessary. That there really is kind of economic recessions, economic expansions don't affect the genders equally. They don't affect the way men and women make collective decisions the same way. And so trying to understand those forces, how policy can affect them and what the long-term implications of them are for things like gender equity and even economic growth and how we raise children and fertility are all linked to that. And that's kind of what we're focusing on and trying to study with these models.
So you have built in some figures, or let's say it's some algorithm or what. No, it's not an algorithm. It's a formula where you make the choices of men and the impact of the shocks on the male gender and on the woman in a different way. So these shocks come not in an equal way to the two people in a household, or two earners, typical two earners in a household.
So that's exactly right. We take into account not only that the shocks hit the two earners in the household differently. For instance, as this current recession most of the job losses were concentrated among industries that are female dominated versus male dominated. So we take things like that into account when we build these models. But even more importantly, what we're actually modeling is the joint decision-making process of the household. Mm-hmm. So for instance, thinking about the current recession, we have the closure of schools, we have the shutting down of daycare. Suddenly there's 20, 30 extra hours of childcare that need to be performed by the household. And so the question is how does your typical couple, your typical household decide who's going to stay home and take care of the kids, who's going to go continue to work? Or in a more normal recession where there isn't the childcare demand, and a recession hits and the husband loses the job, how does the household decide should the wife be working? Should the husband look for a new job? How do they make these collective decisions? And often what you find out when you write down these models is that the things that dictate the collective decisions are things like what are the earnings of the husband relative to the wife? How many children are there? What sort of cultural norms does the couple appeal to in terms of what is normal in terms of who should take care of the kids and who should be working? All these kind of factors affect the way families will respond to the crisis. And at the end of the day, it is families that are making decisions. Something like 50% of our workforce is married couples. And so we think taking these channels into account is sort of first order in understanding how all this works.
What's a telecommutable workplace?
Sure. So I guess the definition of a telecommutable workplace is literally any job or business for which your work could be performed remotely and at home, kind of over the computer. And it became very clear when this recession hit that a big determinant of who was going to lose their job and who was going to keep their job really came down to who was able to work from home during the lockdown and who wasn't. And so that's kind of what we mean when we say telecommuting.
So in our couple, Xenia and Thomas, they have both a telecommutable office job, as she is working in office, he is working in office. So, but as you tell, it's not typical for everyone. You said women are more hit from the lockdown. Is that equal around the world in different countries? Is this? Do you see differences for maybe hospitality or so? It seems to be women-dominated work in US. Is it everywhere the same?
It's certainly mostly the same in the developed world. We've looked at other countries, for instance, the UK, Germany, France, and there in the developed world, it's broadly the same. That most of the jobs that, or I should say the industries that tend to be female dominated, things like education, hospitality, restaurants, these are industries that in a typical recession are not hit that badly. But in the current recession, due in part to social distancing and things like this, have been hit really, really much worse than, say, manufacturing, construction, things like that. And so, yes, it's kind of exactly as you say, this idea that the telecommuting dimension is going to be what drives the added losses of jobs and earnings among women is kind of is a critical distinction here.
We talked about this huge increase of childcare for fathers, especially for married fathers. What do you think? What's the effect on the long run or longer run? Maybe we are talking about 2023, so 2 to 3 years from now. Do you think we will see changes in the norms? As maybe I have talked, of course, to some people here in the podcast, and everyone says, I won't go back to the office or I will take off on Fridays.
Yes. If only we live in
so
world.
This will stay, I guess. This movement, the remote work will stick. I guess you wrote it in your paper too.
Yes, right.
So what does this mean for men and women in 2 to 3 years?
So when I think it's clear, even from the discussion we've had so far, that in the short run, the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, it's certainly women who are suffering more, particularly, I should say, mothers who are suffering kind of the most in the economy. When we look forward to 2023 or even beyond, there are kind of two big changes that we see happening during the crisis that we think, paint a very optimistic picture of what the long run impact of the COVID crisis will be on gender equity. And so one of the dimensions we think about is the working from home revolution that you described. The fact that many businesses have made very big investments in the ability of their workforce to work remotely or work from home. We think many of that will stick around. And this, in the long run, will benefit working moms, because we've seen in the past when a couple has a child and one of the spouses then has to kind of take a back seat professionally in order to help care of the child, is overwhelmingly for decades been the woman who's been forced to do that, the wife, the mother. And so insofar as work becomes more flexible, balancing childcare demands and professional demands becomes easier, this is certainly going to benefit women and their professional progress going forward. The other dimension that you mentioned is sort of cultural norms. As we sort of just discussed earlier, a big change that we've seen in this current crisis is, out of necessity, many households have men now doing unprecedented levels of childcare relative to what they've done in the past. And just as your anecdotal individual refuses to go back to working on Fridays in the office, I'm sure there are many working mothers in this country who now see their husbands doing 50% or maybe even the majority of childcare. And I would find it very hard pressed to believe that any of them are willing to go back to the previous status quo either. And really, to say this in another way, we really think that a lot of the reason that women have had to bear the majority of childcare in the past has really been cultural, has really been these kind of slow moving changes to social and cultural norms. And this crisis has been like a gut punch to this idea. It's kind of showed us all that there's no reason that women should do all the care. Men are totally capable and totally able, and things should be split more equitably. And we really think that this is something that will have long-lasting implications for the way men and women take care and raise their children, and also the professional status of women going forward. This is kind of the silver lining, I should say, that we emphasize for women in the long run.
Only when I was reading through your paper, I saw in the end that shockingly, your model predicted that it will take 20 to 30 years just to bring back the pay gap to the level of pre-COVID. Why does it take so long? And I guess that's not a silver lining.
Yes, that's true. So I should say the particular exercise is if we don't do anything. You know, if we keep the schools closed, if we keep this kind of childcare burden affecting mothers for the duration of the pandemic, then we think the outlook looks quite poor, and it will take, as you say, 20 or 30 years to recover. The question was, why does it take so long? And the fact is, one thing that we know in economics is people who tend to lose their jobs, particularly in recessions, tend to face a very long uphill battle to find a new job of a similar level of responsibility, a similar level of earnings. This is true historically for everybody, for all genders and in almost all time. And what we've seen in this current crisis is that the recessionary impact on women is far greater than it's been in almost any recession in the last 70, 80 years. And so it's just the way the economic machine works is that basically the mothers will voluntarily leave the labor market now in order to take care of children out of necessity, but then they will miss the opportunity to acquire the skills, to build the business networks that then would foster career growth later in life. And it turns out from many, many studies that it's just very, very hard to make up for this lost time. Once you've sort of exited the market, it's very hard to ever come back. And that's really the big
Now
problem.
I have a tricky question. question. You
Sure.
Explained very understandably that in normal recessions, typically jobs in the industry are hit.
Yes.
Where, of course, maybe we see in the past recession some sort of automation, of optimization, and therefore, of course, people will have problem to come back and to work again. Now, you explained that the women in the hospitality and caring and so on are hit. Is this pre-assumption that it's difficult to gain, to start to work again after the recession, the same for the different branches of the economy, or maybe when you are looking for a waitress in a restaurant or someone at the reception of a hotel. Maybe when the hotel is running, he is employing again the people. So that maybe for the industry workforce, a recession is bitter, more bitter and more bad than in the service industry.
I think the fact that the industries that are being hit now maybe are ones where the sort of long-term consequences are not as bad is certainly possible. I think time will tell whether or not that dimension actually affects the female gender gap or women's kind of labor market performance in the future. But I would point out that there are sort of more subtle mechanisms here at work as well. For instance, you might think of the woman being a waitress, as you say. The waitress job perhaps is not that important, but she works as a waitress with the notion that someday, if she works hard, she may become a manager and eventually a restaurant owner. And that entire process, that entire career process is going to be delayed and maybe just never return. The other channel that I want to come back to also is, again, this family channel. Imagine you have a husband and wife where both are working. And for some reason, the mother, because of, say, the childcare demands of the recent pandemic, had to leave the economy, leave the workforce for, say, 6 months if schools remain closed, 6-7 months. It may be the case that even after things return to normal, the husband may say, look, your labor market prospects look quite poor. You've been out of work for 6 months. Your job hasn't come back. If it has come back, it's paying much less. Me, on the other hand, I've been promoted in the meantime. I have new responsibilities. I'm making more money. Why don't we just continue this arrangement where you stay home and I just continue to work more hours because I make more money than you. I have more professional opportunities than you do. And this is then what reinforces this sort of lack of opportunities for women. And so this is really what we're concerned about. It's not so much that the industry is there. It's that it will reinforce this division of labor in the household, which will continue to hold women back in the future. Oh. This is really what we think about. Yeah.
That's what, of course, you hear from many women and many, let's say, activists in gender equality, that this is a pushback of the woman to the kitchen.
In some sense, that's true. In some sense, that's true. Though the thing that we always try to emphasize is that the reason is very different, right? 2019 was a very unusual year, or I should say a very celebratory year in the United States, in the sense that it was the first time in history where women made up the majority of the labor force. And many people have pointed out that it is a bit unfortunate that almost immediately after we get hit with the COVID crisis, that reverses that. And in some sense, this is a metaphor for what you're describing. To what sense, I think the big debate today is to what sense is the current crisis and the unique effect it's having on women going to ultimately lead to cultural and economic change that benefits gender equity, that benefits families and the economy, or whether it's going to become regressive and kind of lead, as you say, pushing women back into the kitchen, taking them out of the labor force. And we think a lot of the effect, I should just add, is going to depend on how policymakers react, how businesses react, and that I think is really why we're pushing this message.
And how the women react.
And how the women react, which is the most important out of all of those, of course. Yes.
As on the other hand, of course, as you describe very brilliantly, that this might be a pushback away from the labor force, pushback to the home, to the kitchen. That of course we can see leadership going remote, as typically we have a picture of leadership happens in the office. No? You stay on Fridays, you stay late to be in the small circles.
Exactly. That's
where
exactly
the decisions are made and to hear what's going on and all that stuff. But what I realize here is, and that it might happen that now leadership goes remote, or even leadership goes to the kitchen. You understand?
Yes, right.
Remote leadership, now leaders are flying from A to C and from UK to the West Coast and the East Coast. So but that you can do leadership from your living room.
So this, again, I think goes back to this idea of the work from home or the telecommuting revolution that has accompanied this current crisis. This idea that it was very easy to work from home, or even better, as you put it, to lead from home, was not something that we were really thinking about in the past, right? You have many surveys talking to, say, professional women who who were doing very well in their careers and left the workforce early. And very often when you ask them why that was the case, why did they leave the labor force, a very common answer is an inability to balance, home care with these professional demands. And so I think what you're describing, this sort of cultural and technological shift to being able to lead from home, or to remove the barriers or the friction between being a caregiver, taking care of a household, taking care of a family, and taking care of a business, removing the distinction or the friction between those two is something transformative that I think we're witnessing right now, and something that in the long run, I think, for the reasons we've discussed, will ultimately really benefit, again, professional women. And so what you describe is very salient, and also, I think, one of the most kind of beautiful silver linings in the long run for women, or so we hope. Yeah, so we hope.
We hope.
Yeah.
When we try to make a little package for our listeners,
sure.
What do you think from your research, from your papers, and maybe the discussion, as there was that broad discussion from BBC to Australia and to Germany, yep, and all over these findings, and so many people resonated with your findings. What would you say for our listeners could be the summary of the actual discussion, maybe even going further than you put it in your paper?
It's a great and very difficult question. If I could summarize it briefly, I would say kind of there's two messages. I think one message is technocratic, and that's to say that this time is different. This pandemic recession is very different from past recessions. It poses a unique set of risks, particularly to families with children, and especially to working mothers. And if policymakers don't recognize that, if we don't do anything specific to ameliorate, say, the childcare demands or the challenges that working parents are facing, the long-term consequences will be very dire, much more dire than in a normal recession. The silver lining to that statement is that if the correct actions are taken, if the moves toward working from home and changing cultural norms around caregiving are changed or reinforced by the media, by policymakers, then actually in the long run, things can turn out much better even. And so this is kind of the main message that we have. This is a moment, we think, for policymakers especially to act in a way that can lead to a transformative effect, we think, to the labor force status, gender equity, caregiving in the United States. But if they don't, things will look very bad. And this is kind of really the main message we want to drive. More broadly, I think the philosophical message we'd like your readers to come away with is that, me and my co-authors and those working in a similar area to us really want to emphasize that we view child rearing or child raising not just as one of the most important social functions that a society engages in, but also one of the most important economic functions, both in terms of the cost, who bears the costs of raising children, but also kind of the benefits that accrue to society of well-raised kids that spend time with their mothers and their fathers. And so I think economists have maybe fallen slightly victim, particularly macroeconomists, to not acknowledging this fact as much as we think they should. But we think the current crisis has brought this into relief. And everyone now understands that raising children, both in terms of the investment and the way they grow up, is sort of a key economic and social phenomenon that really we could do better. And that's really what we're trying to change the discussion around. But that's kind of the long message.
Yeah, that's very, very touchy. I am a mother and I raised my son. I was very much supported by my former husband, so I wasn't a single mother, and I had my mother supported me very much. But I know what it means to raise a child.
Yeah, there you
and
go.
That it's so important for society that it's done in a really heartful and meaningful way. And yeah, that would be very, very great step for macroeconomics to include these ideas into the model. In the end of the interview, I always have a personal question. As I guess you in San Diego, you also had been hit by restrictions in contact, and maybe you are still in some restrictions, as I understand California is not the best place in the world to be.
That is true.
So what is your personal change you think you will stick to after pandemic times?
That's a really fantastic question. I think the boring answer is my hygiene habits are now probably rivaling those of a surgeon pre-pandemic. So that's probably been a big change. But I think kind of more generally, and this is probably true for many people in society, I myself, even as someone who's studied a lot of the issues around childcare, how they affect sort of labor markets, how they affect individuals' career paths, it was always an academic subject to me until the recent recession. And it's not just that I see, kind of what's going on for parents with children, particularly young children who are suffering in the data, but I also see it kind of in my friends, in my extended family, in my work colleagues. And really more than ever, I really have the feeling that this kind of line of research and the sort of real welfare of people, living normal lives every day have never been closer. And I think that this sort of added motivation or added enthusiasm for these issues and the idea that we can somehow do better and improve the lives of people has never been stronger. And I think that's really the big thing that I'm coming away with, is sort of renewed enthusiasm and optimism for what we can achieve. So I can end on an optimistic note. Yeah,
making society a better place for children, women, and fathers and single parents.
That's exactly right.
That and you are young. You can do this.
I have time. I have time to try. Yeah.
Titan, that was very, very great to have you with us. And so thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you.
You've been listening to 2023. To get in touch with us with your comments or ideas, or if you'd like to be a guest on the show, just email hello@20-23.earth. You can find even more material, including transcripts of our interviews, on our website at 20-23.earth. Please keep in mind, the content of this podcast is our opinion. We work hard to get our facts right. However, if you find something that can be corrected or improved, please email us at hello@20-23.earth. If you haven't already done so, we'd be grateful if you would subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you happen to listen. Thanks for listening, stay safe, and there will be springtime in 2023.